Okay, so chapter 10 is substance related, addictive, and impulse control disorders. So, when it comes to substance use disorders, we always have to think about what makes up the nature of somebody who uses substances. These substances are usually psychoactive substances with a wide variety of physiological, psychological, and behavioral aspects. Use of these substances could also be associated with impairment and significant costs. So typically, we think of substance use as something that can negatively impact life experiences. So we need to know the difference between substance use, substance abuse, and substance intoxication. Substance use happens when a person takes a moderate amount of a substance in a way that doesn't interfere with their daily function. So a person might drink a beer occasionally or even daily, but they're still able to go to work and function. Substance intoxication happens when a person has a physical reaction to a substance. So if they drank too many beers, they might become drunk and therefore intoxicated. Substance abuse occurs when a person uses a substance in a way that's dangerous or causes severe, substantial impairment in functioning. They're not able to do their job. They're having relationship issues. So, abuse occurs when it starts to interfere with daily life. Substance dependence can be defined as substance tolerance and can be defined by the symptoms of tolerance and withdrawal. Sometimes it can also be described by drug seeking behavior, like spending a lot of money on a substance. So you depend on it to function on a daily basis. And when we think in terms of tolerance, tolerance occurs when you need more of a substance to get the same original desired effect that you used to get. For example, if I used to drink just 1 cup of coffee a day and I could still function and I felt productive, but now I have to drink 3 cups of coffee to just feel like I can function, that means I've become tolerant of that substance. Withdrawal is a physical symptom that occurs when a person stops using a substance that they normally use. For example, if I decide I suddenly want to stop drinking coffee, I might have jitters, I might have shakes, I might have mind fog, and those are all withdrawal symptoms. So there are 5 main categories of substances people can use. First category are depressants, and these are things like alcohol and different sedatives, and they typically cause behavioral sedation. They tend to have people slow down their central nervous system. Stimulants are the second category of substances, and stimulants tend to stimulate or increase a person's level of alertness and mood. And those are going to be things like cocaine and nicotine and caffeine. The third category is going to be your opiates, and these are things that produce euphoria, reduce pain, things like heroin, morphine, and codeine. Our fourth category are hallucinogens, and they alter sensory perceptions, and those are going to be drugs like LSD. And people are usually shocked that marijuana is actually considered an hallucinogen. And then the fifth category is going to be other drugs of abuse, which might be inhalants, steroids, or different medications. So substance use disorders in the DSM are defined by the criteria you see listed. I'm not going to read all of them, but I'll show them to you. It's from the DSM. Here is the second part of those criteria for substance use disorders. And here's that third part about substance use disorders. So let's go through some of the categories of these different substances that people could use or abuse. First, we have the depressants and the alcohol related disorders. These are going to be disorders that have psychological and physiological effects, that have the psychological and physiological effects of alcohol. So it's a central nervous system depressant, as I told you before. It can involve various neurotransmitters within the brain. It specifically targets GABA, which increases your inhibitory effects and can cause your neural cells to have decreased firing. That's why it's considered a depressant. When a person uses alcohol, there are a few effects of it, such as intoxication and withdrawal symptoms. It can also be associated with various brain conditions like dementia and Wernicke's aphasia. Fetal alcohol syndrome is a condition that can occur if a mother consumes alcohol when she is pregnant with a child in her womb, and that means the baby is born with some physical and oftentimes developmental impairments. Here are the DSM criteria for alcohol use disorder. And there's lots of criteria for this. Here's some more of those criteria. And here are the rest of those criteria. So as you can see, there are a lot of things that could be involved with substance use disorder. Lots of different factors that could play into it over a 1-year period. If you look at this diagram that's in your textbook, it shows us the path that alcohol travels through the body, and we know that it eventually will be metabolized within the liver. In the United States, most adults consider themselves to be light drinkers or social drinkers. Alcohol use is highest among Caucasian Americans, and males tend to use and abuse alcohol more than females. 23% of Americans report engaging in binge drinking. Violence can also be associated with alcohol use, but it's not alcohol alone that causes aggression, because alcohol is a depressant on the central nervous system. There's probably some other cultural or environmental or genetic factors that also play a role. When it comes to abuse and dependence, about 3 million Americans are alcohol dependent. 20% of people with alcohol problems experience spontaneous recovery. So those symptoms come back randomly, even after they have tried to stop using alcohol. There's a large variety in alcohol use statistics across the world. For example, in Peru, 1 in 3 adults is dependent on alcohol, where in Shanghai, it's less than 1% of alcohol dependence. There are a few racial differences in alcohol use, as I discussed before, and not, I would say, dramatic differences, but we do find that the differences between binge drinking and heavy alcohol use tends to vary by race. You can see what those percentages are. Next, we have our sedative, hypnotic, and Anxiolytic-related disorders. And these are going to be things like sedatives, which calm you down. Those are barbiturates, sleeping pills, and things like that. And then we also have hypnotics, which induce sleep, analytics, and healytics, which are anxiety-reducing drugs like benzodiazepines. These drugs have effects that are similar to large doses of alcohol, and oftentimes people combine these drugs with alcohol, which is not always a good idea. They all exert their influence by affecting the neurotransmitter GABA. And as you can see, there are some DSM criteria for this class of disorders. Here are the rest of those DSM criteria as well. There are quite a few slides listing all the criteria because there's lots of them as well. So one thing you'll find about many of the substance use disorders is that there are many ways a person can be diagnosed with one of these disorders because there are a lot of criteria that must happen within a 12-month period. So within 1 year, there has to be at least two of these symptoms occurring within a 12-month period. So there's lots of symptoms. You only need two of them for it to be considered a disorder, according to the DSM. And we also have some specificity here on whether or not it's a mild case, a moderate case, or a severe case. You see, those mild cases might just be with 2 or 3 symptoms. And then the severe is all the way up to 6 or more symptoms. And when there's only 11 criteria and you meet 6 or more of those, that clearly is problematic. We also have stimulants, and stimulants are the most widely used substance in the United States. These are going to be drugs that increase one's level of alertness and energy. These are things like amphetamines, methamphetamines, cocaine, nicotine, and caffeine. And here are some of the DSM criteria as well for stimulants. When it comes to the effects of amphetamines, these are drugs that produce elation, vigor, and reduce fatigue. Um, After use, they can be followed by extreme fatigue and depression. The amphetamines tend to stimulate, so they're called stimulants because they speed up the central nervous system and enhance the release of dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain. Some ADHD medications are considered mild stimulants, drugs like Adderall and Ritalin. And ecstasy and crystal meth are also two forms of stimulants, but they don't usually produce a crash and they have very high risk of dependence. Here are some DSM criteria for stimulants. Notice again, you need to have at least two of the symptoms that occur within a 12-month period. And once again, we've got about 11 symptoms that could occur. We also have those specifiers for mild, moderate, and severe, and they're the same as they were before. Over 6 is considered a severe case. Next, we have our cocaine-related disorders. These are going to be disorders that are due to the effects of cocaine use. Typically, it's a short-lived sensation of elation and reduced fatigue. It blocks the reuptake of dopamine in the brain. It's also a drug that's very highly addictive, but that addiction can develop a lot slower than some of the other drugs. About 1.9 million people in the United States report use of cocaine every year. Most people who use this substance will cycle through patterns of tolerance and withdrawal. Withdrawal is often characterized by apathy and boredom, which will lead to the desire to use again. And most people don't like the effects of withdrawal anyways, so they continue to use a drug because they want to avoid those effects. Here are some of the effects of nicotine. It is a stimulant as well, and can result in relaxation, wellness, and pleasure. It's also very highly addictive and has a high relapse rate, very equal to the relapse rates we see with alcohol and heroin. And, despite the fact that a pack of cigarettes can cost, it is very expensive, people who are highly addicted to it will spend just about anything for it. Nicotine users dose themselves to maintain a steady state of nicotine, so they, have it down to how often they should engage in nicotine use. Smoking has a complex relationship to a negative effect. It appears to help improve the person's mood, but only in the short term. Depression typically occurs in those people who have nicotine dependence. Here are those DSM criteria for tobacco use disorder. Once again, there needs to be, sorry about that, at least 2 criteria that occur within a 12-month period. There are, again, about 11 criteria total. And we also have those specifiers for how severe the disorder is. Here's also the DSM criteria for tobacco withdrawal. Once a person has gone off the substance, we know that they're experiencing withdrawal if these things happen. And there's another chart within your book that I think is important for us to look at. It shows us the relapse rates for different substances. And you can see that if we all start out, trying to abstain from using the drug, eventually, some people relapse. And out of all the drugs, the relapse rate for alcohol is much higher than the others. And that's oftentimes why people will continue to attend something like Alcoholics Anonymous to help them prevent further relapse. Next, we have our caffeine-related disorders. The effects of caffeine is often known as a gentle stimulant. Many of us consume caffeine on a daily basis, about 90% of Americans every day. Caffeine can be found in tea, coffee, soft drinks like cola and cocoa products. A small dose of caffeine can elevate your mood and reduce fatigue. Regular use can result in tolerance and dependence, and caffeine tends to block the reuptake of the neurotransmitter adenosine. Here are the DSM criteria for caffeine-related disorders. Here are the rest of those criteria. So if you have 5 or more of those symptoms, there could be caffeine intoxication. Here are the remaining criteria for caffeine intoxication. Next, we have opioids. An opiate is a natural chemical in the opium poppy plant that has narcotic effects. Opioids are natural and synthetic substances that have narcotic effects. These are often drugs that are painkillers and are very, very highly addictive. It activates, when a person uses these opioids, it activates their body's natural endorphins, which endorphins are our body's natural painkillers. Low doses can produce euphoria and drowsiness and slow breathing. High doses can result in death. So that's when we see people who often OD on some type of opioid when they've had too much of a dose. Those withdrawal symptoms can be long lasting and severe, and the mortality rate for people who use opioids is very, very high. There's also a high risk of HIV infection because oftentimes people who use opioids use needles and they tend to share those needles with others. When somebody is really addicted to something, they don't necessarily think about hygiene and what's in their best interest. Sometimes the drug makes decisions for them. Here are the DSM criteria for opioid use disorder. Once again, you need at least 2 of these criteria within a 12-month period, and there are 11 criteria as well. We also have those specifiers of mild, moderate, and severe. So when it comes to the nature of hallucinogens, there's a chance that the user perceives the world differently when they use a hallucinogen. It could produce delusions, hallucinations, some type of altered sensory perception. That's why they're called hallucinogens, because they cause people to hallucinate. So LSD, very common. People typically know that that's a hallucinogen, but so is marijuana. And about 5 to 15% of people in Western countries, smoke marijuana regularly. And of course, the fact that marijuana is legalized in many states also plays a role in that. I would venture to guess that that number could even be higher. Marijuana has an active chemical called THC. It can produce symptoms of mood swings, paranoia, hallucinations. It can cause impairment in motivation. And also, withdrawal and dependence tend to be rare. LSD and other hallucinogens um, have much more intense effects than marijuana. Tolerance to them is rapid, and withdrawal symptoms are also uncommon. They can produce delusions and hallucinations. And here are those DSM criteria for cannabis use disorder for those people who use marijuana. And there's at least 2 criteria out of 11 with those symptoms of those categories of mild, moderate, and severe as well. We also have the DSM criteria for other hallucinogen use disorder. So these could be LSD or anything else. Also, 2 of these criteria within a 12-month period. For this one, there's only 10 criteria instead of 11, along with those specifiers of mild, moderate, and severe. We also have other drugs of abuse like inhalants. Inhalant, Inhalants are going to be things that people breathe directly into their lungs, like paint, hairspray, gasoline, and nitrous oxide. These things are rapidly absorbed into the bloodstream and can have similar effects to alcohol intoxication. There could be tolerance and prolonged symptoms of withdrawal as well. Here are the DSM criteria for inhalant use disorders. Again, you need 2 of these criteria within a 12-month period. There are also 10 criteria for this one, with the specifiers of mild, moderate, and severe. We also have anabolic steroids, which are steroids that people receive or some type of synthetic testosterone. These could be used medically to help a person increase their body mass. Users may sometimes engage in cycling or what's called stacking. This drug does not produce a high, but can result in long term mood disturbances and physical problems. So, oftentimes, when people use steroids, people will say that their behavior has changed drastically. We also have things like designer drugs, and these are drugs that were originally produced by pharmaceutical companies to target diseases, but then people started using them recreationally. These drugs can cause drowsiness, pain relief, and dissociative symptoms, things like Special K, Nexus, and ecstasy. These drugs also heighten auditory and visual perceptual problems and taste and touch sensations. They have become very popular in large social recreational gatherings like nightclubs, at raves, and they produce symptoms of tolerance and dependence. There are also some family and genetic influences that we have to make light of when it comes to substance related disorders. Because when we look at family, twin, and adoption studies, we know that substance abuse has a genetic component. For example, it's been found that genetic risk for heroin abuse in Latino and Black populations is high. There's been a lot of focus on research when it comes to alcoholism, and we know that there are lots of genetic differences in how culturally people metabolize alcohol, and that can impact which drugs are most effective for treating the alcohol abuse. And we know that there are multiple genes involved in substance abuse as well. When we think of causes of substance related disorders from a neurobiological standpoint, drugs tend to affect the pleasure pathway in the brain. Those areas of dopamine, of receiving rewards, is greatly impacted. The GABA system will turn off that reward pleasure system so that people feel pleasure from the substance. And drugs that inhibit those neurotransmitters tend to produce anxiety and negative affect. From a psychological standpoint, positive and negative reinforcement can play a role in a person's use of substances early on. Drugs might be help a person receive a high, which is positive reinforcement. And later, drug users might try to escape and they go through withdrawals. They crash and they're negatively reinforced to continue the substance. Substance abuse usually is used as a means to cope with those negative with negative affect, like self-medication, tension reduction, how a person should handle their life stressors. And we also know that there are some cognitive factors. People who use drugs when they anticipate or they think that something positive will happen to them. People also experience craving. And the opponent process theory says that, after a drug is used and there's been a crash, the easiest way to alleviate those feelings of crashing is to not go through those withdrawal symptoms. From a social and cultural standpoint, exposure to drugs can be a prerequisite for drug use. If you're around friends or family or the media sensationalizes drug use, chances are you'll use it. So there's some different societal views about drug use as well. It could be a sign of moral weakness and failure to be in self-control if you can't handle it. And those can impact whether or not a person uses a substance as well. Some cultures expect heavy drinking at social occasions, and those cultural expectations could influence drug related behavior. If drinking is thought to increase aggressiveness, people may act in more aggressive ways after drinking, even though the drugs didn't, quote unquote, make them do that. So if we think about an integrative model of substance related disorders, being exposed to certain drugs is necessary but not sufficient. Drug use depends on social and cultural expectations, positive and negative reinforcement, genetic predisposition, and psychosocial factors as well. And if we look at this integrative model of substance related disorders picture, we can see how it kind of becomes a vicious cycle. When it comes to treatment of substance related disorders, there are often some different treatment methods that can be used. Things like methadone and nicotine gum can help. Drugs that are going to block or counteract the positive effect of substances are also helpful. Sometimes aversive treatment, so making the person no longer want the substance or associating it with something negative, can be effective. There can be some biological treatments, which are typically ineffective if they're used alone because they're going to create some good response to withdrawal symptoms, but it doesn't stop somebody from the desire to use the substance. Sometimes people have to go in inpatient or outpatient care for support. There's Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous that can be helpful. Having a balanced level of treatment goals can also help with substance use and being able to incorporate psychotherapy and contingency management as well. Sometimes people are in more comprehensive and prevention programs like individual and group therapy, aversion therapy, community reinforcement, relapse prevention efforts. There's been a recent shift away from just education and greater enforcement of anti-drug laws to help people understand why it's so necessary not to use substances. So to summarize, with substance-related disorders, there are 4 classes: depressants, stimulants, opiates, and hallucinogens, and they all can include intoxication, withdrawal, and substance use disorders. Most substances activate the dopamine pleasure pathway, and treatment of substance use disorders, abuse disorders, is often unsuccessful. The person has to be highly motivated to do their best, and it's important to use a comprehensive approach. Gambling disorder is a new disorder that's in the DSM. It was last called one of the addictive disorders. And this is when a person recurrently gambles and it causes distress or impairment in their life. It's typically associated with 4 or more of these symptoms that happen within a year. Here are the DSM criteria for a gambling disorder. 4 or more of these within a 12-month period. We also tend to have those specifiers of mild, moderate, and severe. And when it comes to treating a gambling disorder, we're going to use many of the treatment methods we would use for substance abuse. Treatment is often ineffective, and it has to be some motivation to get better. Research on gambling disorder is very limited, but cognitive behavioral interventions are currently being investigated. And we also have impulse control disorders. These are going to be disorders where a person has a sense of relief after they do something, where they might experience anxiety and tension before they do something. And it can involve disorders like intermittent explosive disorder, kleptomania, and pyromania. Intermittent explosive disorder is a rare condition where people have aggressive outbursts, where they can destruct property, and there's not a lot of treatment studies over the disorder. Kleptomania occurs when a person fails to resist the urge to steal things. It seems rare, but it's not real well studied. It's often also comorbid with other mood disorders and can co-occur with substance-related problems. And then pyromania happens when a person can't resist the urge to set fires. It's usually diagnosed in just 3% of arsonists. There's not also a lot of research in this area, and treatment usually focuses on identifying urges and practices that are incompatible behaviors. So to summarize, for those non-substance disorders related to addiction, they can be impulsive and self-destructive behaviors, and they can include gambling disorder, intermittent explosive disorder, kleptomania, and pyromania. And research in these areas is very rare, but if this is something you're interested in and you're thinking about going into the field of psychology, it's certainly an area of research that's necessary. I hope all of this information has been helpful to you guys in understanding substance-related, addictive, and impulse control disorders.